Good evening, everybody. I'm Megan Castillo. I'm Town Hall's program manager. On behalf of Town Hall Seattle, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's live stream conversation with author Laila Lalami and fellow writer Viet Thanh Nguyen. As we get underway, I would like to acknowledge that our institute stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continued use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. Thank you for tuning in. Town Hall is proud to be a community-focused organization and a place where we can share and sustain ideas and creativity, even if that means we can't gather in person. I'd like to thank Laila and Viet Thanh for appearing tonight to make that possible. Town Hall will be continuing to produce virtual content this fall, and many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form on our digital media library. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming programs include Bruce and Yu-Chan Fulton about their translation of Korean literature, Senator Sherrod Brown with Dow Constantine about the legacy of progressivism in the U.S., Yolande Strenger and Jenny Kennedy with a proposal for an needed update to our feminized digital assistants, and more. Town Hall and the nonprofit community at large have been put under significant strain due to event cancellations and the ever-changing landscape. We hope you will consider extending a donation, extending your generosity to help support us during this difficult time by making a donation by clicking on the donate button at the bottom of your screen or becoming a member. You can make a donation online or text Town Hall to 44321 to give. Our partner booksellers have been hit by the negative effects of the Our civic series is supported by Real Networks Foundation, True Brown Foundation, KUOW, and Wincote Foundation Northwest. Finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank all of our members watching tonight. Viet Thanh Nguyen is a writer whose novel, The Sympathizer, is a New York Times bestseller and won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. His other books are Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam in the Memory of War, a finalist for the National Book Award in Nonfiction, and Race and Resistance, Literature and Politics in Asian America. He is a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times and a professor of English, American Studies and Ethnicity, and Comparative Literature at the University of Southern California. Laila Lalami is born in Rabat and educated in Morocco, Great Britain, and the United States. Her essays have appeared in the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, The Nation, Harper's, The Guardian, the New York Times, and she has received fellowships from the British Council, the Fulbright Program, and the Guggenheim Foundation, and is currently a professor of creative writing at the University of California at Riverside. She is the author of 4 award-winning books, Secret Sun, Hope and Other Dangerous Pursuits, The Other Americans, and The Moors Account. The Moors Account, published in 2014, won the American Book Award, the Arab American Book Award, the Hurston Wright Legacy Award, and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction. Her most recent novel, The Other Americans, was published in 2019 and was a finalist for the National Book Award in Fiction. Lalami's book, Conditional Citizens on Becoming in America, is the topic of tonight's conversation. Please join me in welcoming Laila Lalami and Viet Thanh Nguyen.
Thanks, Megan, for that introduction. Hi, Laila.
Hi, Viet. How are you?
I am good. How are you?
Good.
So the audience does not know that we've already been talking for half an hour in the green room. And I really wish, for the audience's sake, that they had actually been there, because we had a great conversation about
we solved everything.
So we'll kind of recapture some of that energy. You know, we know each other for quite a while. I'm a big fan of your work. Love the Moors Account. Everybody should read the Moors Account.
Thank you.
And of course, we're here to celebrate and to talk about this new book, Conditional Citizens, which I can see right there behind you in your office bookshelf. And for those of you who are watching, yes, all writers have bookcases exactly like this. This is what we aspire to. This is my idea of heaven, anyway, is to die and be surrounded by books. Okay, seriously, that's what I want to happen to me. I'm just so thrilled to talk to you, and unfortunately, your book is totally relevant. I wish we lived in a time where we did not need to have your book, did not have to talk about the issues that your book raises. I'm not sure when you wrote the book, over what time period, but it feels as if you were writing it yesterday. in terms of how your notion of conditional citizenship speaks to things that are happening literally this week. Okay. But the first thing I want to talk about is actually the ceremony of citizenship itself in the United States, because I just got an email from my editor this morning who is British, and he got his American citizenship today.
Oh, Peter.
And of course I was like, are you crazy? You know, what a choice, UK citizenship or USA citizenship, what a choice. But he got his citizenship in New York, and here's what, I'm just gonna read one little line of what he said. Oh, I didn't ask his permission, so hopefully it's okay. But he said, he was in this waiting room filled with people who represent so much of what is beautiful to me about America. And even so, you can really feel the fear in people's questions, halting responses, and studying over the civics test questions. And actually, I got my citizenship around the time when I was about 12 or so, but I was attached to my mother, so she took the citizenship exam. I was just tagging along in the federal courthouse of San Jose, and she failed her first exam. And I'm sitting there at 12 years old, a little bit anxious. I know this is important. I know I have no control over this. It's my mother, who is this refugee from Vietnam like myself, who has to answer these questions. And I'm sitting there thinking, I can answer these questions. The pressure on my mother and on all these people that are in these citizenship rooms. And so in your book, you start off fairly early in the book talking about your own process of becoming a citizen, because you were born in Morocco and then you came to the US as a student. So can you talk to us about what that was like for you to make that decision and then to become a citizen?
Yeah, so like Peter's ceremony, mine was also very moving. It was at the Pomona Fairplex, which I will talk about in a second. And I think it was several thousand people. I think I would put the number about 3,000 people. It was very hot. It's like in the 90s. And it is exactly as Peter described it. You are surrounded by people who are from all over the world. And everybody's joined together in this ceremony. And I remember that the judge was I think he was a Chinese American judge. And he, sort of gave us like this speech about the rights and responsibilities that awaited us, and talk about how, and I remember that he talked about how people who want to become citizens do it because they love the ideals of America, not because there's something that they don't like about their country. And I remember thinking that's interesting that he had to make that point. And for me, the decision, which I took very seriously, was made because when I came to the United States, my intention had been to complete a PhD at USC where you teach. And I just realized I have a glass. And then to return home to Morocco, where I was going to work as a college professor of linguistics. And, but a couple of years later, I met my husband, who's sitting on the other side and watching me speak. And then we got married, and then I faced a decision, we faced a decision where we're going to live, whether it was going to be in his country or in mine. And we decided to live here. And in the process of sort of embracing him, I embraced also his country. So for me, it is very much a story of love, but it's also a story of a relationship. So in the book, that is why I liken it to a relationship. And in the course of having this relationship that has had deepened over the last 20 years, it is something that I have given a great deal of thought to, because I do think that relationships require work, and they also require honesty. And so part of the reason that I wanted to write this book is that I wanted to reflect on the experiences of Arabs and Muslims in America, and then it grew out of that into something bigger. But I said I would mention what happened with the Pomona Fairplex. I discovered in the course of thinking back about that ceremony and deciding to write about it, that the Pomona Fairplex had served as an assembly center for Japanese Americans in 1942. So people who lived all over Southern California had to report to that center before they were shipped off to Wyoming to a concentration camp, where they were there until the end of the war. And of course, we all know what that ugly history was like, and the dispossession of Japanese Americans and their internment and all of that. And I thought, I almost fell out of my chair when I discovered that fact, that the same country that puts people in these concentration camps reuses that same location to swear in new citizens. And it turned out that a lot of these assembly centers ended up being in places that served as locations for county fairs. So all over the states, that's one of the places that they used. And of course, if you're looking to do swearing in ceremonies with large numbers of people, oftentimes you're going to use the same locations. But I did think that to me, it seemed incredible that that's where it took, and that there was no marker. Like when you park there and you go, when I parked there and I went into my citizenship ceremony, there was nothing to indicate this history, and it was this real erasure of its history that it took decades and a lot of advocacy on the part of Japanese Americans here in Southern California to finally have a plaque installed to mark that experience. And so it is that sort of embrace and rejection of citizens that I call conditional citizenship, and that I wanted to write about in the book.
Yeah, my favorite shopping mall is located across from the city. Sorry, it's because it has great Asian food. It has great Asian food. Okay,
I'm talking about Japanese.
I'm going to get there. I'm going to get there. So it's Santa Anita. It's located from across the street from the Santa Anita racetrack, and the Santa Anita racetrack in Southern California is another one of these staging centers where Japanese Americans were relocated en masse and put into horse stables before they were shipped off. Yeah. And again, I do wonder how many people who visit Santa Anita or even live in that city around that racetrack know that this is the history. Yeah. And this is America. This is the United States. I mean, there are all kinds of places like this all over the country where these terrible events took place. And like you said, there are no markers for it because Americans have like many other nationalities, have a hard time confronting the complexities and the contradictions of their past. Yeah. And I think it's not wrong to point out that these contradictions and complexities happened. Oftentimes when you bring these issues forward, people who oppose this will say, well, look, I mean, the Chinese have done this and the Vietnamese have done that and the Russians have done this. And of course they have. We're not responsible for them. We're talking about this country and the necessity to acknowledge that this country, like every other, is built on contradictions. We have freedom and liberty and equality, and we have slavery and genocide and colonialism. Yeah. And the challenge for us is to think of both things existing at the very same time. And I think that's what your book is arguing for. It's arguing that we have a notion of citizenship that we all take very seriously. And for those of us who are refugees and immigrants, we go through the ceremonies. If you're a native-born American, I don't know how much time you have spent thinking about what it means to be a citizen, but immigrants and refugees have to think about it because you study for the exam, you go through the ceremony, you wave your flag, you take your oath. It's a real thing. Yeah. And then your book is about pointing out how, despite this beautiful notion of formal equal citizenship for everybody, there are conditions about this citizenship whereby so many different kinds of populations don't actually have full access. Right. Formal citizenship. So can you explain for the audience what you mean by conditional citizenship? Yeah,
you're right. First of all, this whole idea, when you were talking about like erasure, I was thinking about Central Park and like the whole history of what has happened in Central Park and the original town that was built there by African Americans that was raised to put Central Park, and the history even before that of indigenous people, and none of that, of course, is remembered or talked about. But to your question about conditional citizenship, it grew out of as I said, wanting to write about the experience of America of Arabs and Muslims, and realizing that for each thing I could write about, there was a parallel that some other community had gone through. So, for example, if I talk about the concept of allegiance, like because I'm an immigrant and a naturalized citizen, what happens is that if I write about Morocco and I write critically about Morocco, unfailingly Americans call me brave. But if I write critically about the United States, I'm called ungrateful. And people are saying that, people say, in fact, even after this book came out, I've gotten emails about that. about that. So there is a certain sense in which your allegiance is conditional on your silence. And any dissent is perceived as a sign of like sedition. That is an experience that I mentioned Japanese Americans have gone through, right? If I started to think about the requirement or the demand that we have to assimilate into society, and that somehow we're uniquely incapable of assimilating. The president, for example, has said that Muslims don't assimilate. There's no assimilation there in his usually articulate way of speaking. But if I think about the experience of assimilation, then I would have to connect it with, for example, assimilation into white society being a condition of citizenship, for example, for indigenous people who until 1924 were not citizens of this country. And prior to that had to file petitions of citizenship. And if they were deemed to not have assimilated into white society, they could be denied. And of course, the whole history of assimilation with Native Americans, where children were forcibly removed from their parents and put into Indian boarding schools, where they were forbidden from wearing their hair in native styles or using their own native names or speaking their native languages. All of this was a forced process of assimilation. So when we think about assimilation, that is something that I would have to connect it with. If I think about surveillance, which, as you know, for example, American Muslims are among the most surveilled groups in the United States. And a few years ago, there was this huge Pulitzer Prize-winning investigation by the Associated Press, by two reporters of the Associated Press, that revealed that the New York Police Department had spied on Muslims something popped in the kitchen. that they spied on Muslims by infiltrating their homes by means of subterfuge. So, for example, they would come and say, oh, we're investigating the crime, and we come in and talk to you about it. There's a crime in the neighborhood, and the person would let them in. And these are cops that are taking note about things that exist in your home. They would infiltrate mosques. They went into restaurants. If we talk about surveillance of Muslims, then we have to connect it to surveillance of other groups, like, for example, off the top of my head, civil rights leaders and programs like COINTELPRO and all of that. So for each of these experiences that I can point to with Arabs and Muslims in America, I was able to connect it to something else that had happened to other communities. So it wasn't necessarily specific to them. It was really a way of how citizens who were not at the center of what citizenship as a concept was designed for, who were kind of on the periphery of that citizenship, how they are treated. And that's what I mean by conditional citizenship. You are a citizen if you show your allegiance through silence or through agreement with what the government is doing. If you dissent, your citizenship is called into question. We've seen this, for example, with Rashida Tlaib of Michigan, Ilhan Omar of Minnesota. We've seen it with Colin Kaepernick. We see it periodically where any form of dissent is deemed to be sedition. And then people tell you to go back to your country. I get emails like that. I don't know if you get emails like that. I'm sure you do, right?
I get hate mail that's been written and put into an envelope and sent with a stamp. For some reason, the people who hate me just need to write me a letter.
I have gotten those. I have, and I always marvel, to be honest with you, at the effort that it takes to sit up and look up either my email address or my office address at the university and write me a letter and put it in the envelope and put the stamp and send it to me. And so I collect some of that stuff and I save it, and then eventually it ends up in an essay. But anyway, so the point is that citizenship is in this sense policed, and people who are deemed to be on the boundaries of it can never take their belonging to be secure. It will be called into question.
Mm-hmm. Let me remind the audience, by the way, that you should, hey, you have a glass of wine. That is so unfair. If the terms of this had been sped out earlier, I would totally be here with like a big double of scotch. But anyway, I feel responsible to be sober during our Q&A process. But hey, audience members, there is an ask a question window on your screen. Please ask a question. I have a whole bunch of questions lined up for Laila. I can talk with her for quite a long time, but I think it'd be nice to get some questions from the audience. Laila, when you brought up assimilation, it reminded me of one of my favorite parts of your book, just because I'm personally invested, when you brought up the issue of Europeans and assimilation.
Yes.
You were in Morocco, and you talk about how when you were growing up there, you had French teachers from France who never learned to speak the language. They just kept speaking French, and everyone said, of course, they no one questioned the fact that they never assimilated.
Yeah.
And if you had the luxury of being a European or American abroad, although you should be white at the same time, you're called an expat, right? And no one expects you to speak the local language. You could live in a foreign country for 20 years, marry a local person, and typically a woman, and never be expected to learn the language. And that is such a huge privilege that comes with these passports of formerly colonizing countries.
Yeah.
That we who are formerly colonized do not have that same privilege.
Yeah.
So even when I go abroad, I have a U.S. passport, I'm never an expat. It's just not.
I was gonna say they're not even called immigrants; they're called expats. That's the thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So there is a lot of privilege there.
Yeah. So when I was born and raised in Morocco, and during my years of schooling there, I had a number of French teachers. And I don't remember a single one of them speaking a single word of Arabic. The most that they would know is like the greeting of hello and goodbye. And that would be considered, that's it. And it was really incredible that in teaching us formerly colonized people, long after we had gotten independence, like decades later, but if my parents wanted to communicate with a teacher and find out how I was doing in school, they had to communicate with the teacher in French. The French teacher you had to communicate with in French. You couldn't communicate in your language. And so if you didn't speak French, then that was a huge barrier for you to kind of communicate with your daughter or your son's teacher. And nobody thought it strange, and nobody questioned it. And there were no speeches in Parliament demanding that these French workers in our country should speak the language. In fact, even the idea seems laughable if you mention it to a French person, because, well, everybody speaks, French, but it's not true. Everybody does not speak French in Morocco. That is absolutely not true. And so I think that what it really shows is that assimilation really is about power. It's about who gets to say, you assimilate to me and you must be like me, and I deem you to have assimilated to me sufficiently that you can, that I will extend belonging to you and that you can be a part of our society.
But when you wrote your book, it was pre-COVID era, I assume. And of course, in the COVID era, for those of us who are Asian Americans who look like we are East Asian in some fashion or other, we face this issue of assimilation because the Trump administration has chosen to describe COVID-19 as the China virus, the Wuhan virus, and so on, and insist that it's not a racist term and it's about China, not about people in the United States. But the experience of Asian Americans totally belies that, because there's so much of a record now of Asian Americans being verbally and physically assaulted on the basis of being perceived as carriers of this Chinese virus, for example. And this would extend to people who have been here, they're American born or even multiple generations.
Yeah.
And yet their assimilation is still called into question, or even their belonging. It's not even a question of assimilation. They're born here, but all of a sudden their citizenship is conditional because of this kind of allegation. So there's many ways in which for those of us who are not white, we're people of color, we're minorities of some kind, some of us at least are aware that there is always the potential for the condition to suddenly appear, depending on whatever geopolitical emergency is taking place.
Yeah. I was going to say two things about that. One was that there was a House resolution condemning anti-Asian racism recently that, you would think that it would not be too much to ask our elected representatives to condemn anti-Asian racism, and yet there were more than 100 Republicans who voted against it. Why? I have no idea. You can fill in the blank about why that might be. And the other thing I would say, and this is more relevant to the concept of conditional citizenship, is that at the beginning of the crisis, so I would put this at maybe March or April, Andrew Yang, who has made many very useful contributions to our national discourse with UBI, took to the pages of the Washington Post to denounce anti-Asian racism. But he also said that Asians needed to volunteer and embrace Americanness and wear red, white, and blue. And it's this is exactly what this idea of conditionality appears, because even though he's Asian, he's sensing in a way that there is going to be this this backlash against Asians, and his answer is to embrace Americanness, which, so if you wear red, white, and blue, somebody's not going to insult you, somebody's not going to be racist against you. It's a little silly, but it really goes to show that how seductive this idea of showing your allegiance can be, that it can be even expressed by somebody as smart as Andrew Yang.
Well, I think your notion of conditional citizenship and unconditional citizenship speaks to so many issues happening in our country today. And so in your book, you go through several different types of conditions. But of course, this country has been in the grips of a severe crisis of citizenship and belonging
throughout its history.
I mean, sparked by the murder of George Floyd and the high visibility of Black Lives Matter protests. But of course, this is something that's been happening before George Floyd. But nevertheless, for the last few months, so much visibility has arisen around this question of the value of the lives of Black people, the belongingness of Black people to this country, and your stance on Black Lives Matter speaks a lot, not you specifically, but you in general, speaks a lot to your stance on whether there is or isn't such a thing as conditional citizenship. Because I think there are a lot of people in this country who will say there is no such thing as conditional citizenship, and if you bring it up, you're just serving to divide us. And likewise, on this issue of Black Lives Matters, your stance on that says, well, either black people in this country actually do have conditional citizenship, or they refuse to take on unconditional citizenship, depending on your perspective on what's taking place. And in your book, you go through a whole litany of historical situations whereby conditional citizenship has been enacted by this country and by this government. You talk about broken contracts, broken promises, broken treaties with native tribes, unequal punishments when it comes to crime laws, drug punishments, things like this. We can go on and on, unequal application of capital punishment and so on and so forth. And so the killings of Black people are just the most recent visible traumatic manifestation of that. And of course, this week, we have the legal decision on Breonna Taylor, where Breonna Taylor is killed in her bed by police bullets, and no one is held responsible. I mean, no one is actually held responsible for shooting her. The only police officer put up on charges is for shooting bullets into another apartment for wanton endangerment, I believe, is a charge.
Yep.
So, for many Black people, this is a total slap in the face, and it tells them that they have conditional citizenship. I think you would agree with what I'm saying, but my point is partly, well, how do you respond to people who say there is no such thing as conditional citizenship, and by you bringing it up, you're just dividing the country again on this issue?
I think that, well, first of all, it's impossible to look. What I would say to people like that is to step back and look at what the Constitution promises you, which is that regardless of your background, that everybody is treated the same under the law, right? Everybody is supposed to be protected. Everybody is supposed to have the same rights, the same liberties, and the same protections under the Constitution. But if you look at encounters between the citizen and the state or its representatives, so this would be in the case of Breonna Taylor, so it would be the cops, and you look at the outcomes of these encounters, whether it is in a roadside police encounter, whether it is at the Veteran Administration, whether it is at the public school gates, the welfare office, the voting booth. There is no way in which, looking at the statistical outcomes of those encounters, that you can claim that everybody is equal under the law. The right to vote, which is the most basic right of citizenship, is not afforded to everybody in this country. The biggest example of that is what happens with incarcerated people who are denied the right to vote if they become felons. So while they are incarcerated, and then after, and at the same time, the same system that denies them the right to vote is not denying them the right to work. So these people are not only allowed, but in some cases forced to work, and then taxed on their meager earnings, forced to repay their court costs, forced to repay the cost of incarcerating them. And on top of that, they don't have the right to vote. It's so enraging to think that anybody would look at the conditions of American society today and think that there is anything like equal citizenship. There is not. And in the case of Breonna Taylor, the system has essentially said that that those police officers failed in their duties when a bullet went through the apartment next door, but not the apartment upstairs. That is a failure of their duty. But the fact that a young woman who has committed no crime, has no police record, they shouldn't even have been at her place in the first place, that her killers have not committed a crime, and that it's a tragedy. That's what the district attorney said. Not the district attorney, the attorney general said that it was a tragedy. And I think we have to look squarely in the face the fact that the system is designed to produce these tragedies. It's designed to produce these tragedies and to absolve and to make sure that there is not that we are not looking at these tragedies as the crimes that they really are.
Right. Let me remind the audience, there's an ask a question window. Make sure to ask your questions. I'll be looking for those questions soon. We've touched on religion, race, nationality as various conditions that could be attached to citizenship. One of the other conditions that you bring up is in a chapter called Caste, which deals
This is before I knew that there was a book.
Yeah, good timing, right?
Yes.
It's so, for those of you who don't know, Isabel Wilkerson, the author of The Warmth of Other Suns, about the Great Black Migration, has a new book called Caste, about caste in American life. It's a huge bestseller right now, and I'll be interviewing her for the Portland Book Festival, so it's on my mind too. But you talk about your experiences as an immigrant coming to study at USC and having to find an apartment in Los Angeles near USC, and the difficulties of finding something affordable, and you finding yourself in literally a flea-bitten apartment studio. But you are a transient, you say, because you're a graduate student, and so everybody else looks at you as someone who has another possibility in the future you're preparing for, to get a PhD. Everybody else who is in this apartment complex is stuck there. They're not getting another degree, right? Yeah. And so you have a whole swath of American life represented in your apartment building of people who cannot afford to get out of these flea-bitten apartments. And it makes you think about the caste system in the United States. And I thought that was really interesting, because at the end of the story, you bring out how your very nice landlord says to you, well, I want to keep you happy because you're one of the good people. So I'll be flexible with you on the rent.
Yeah.
And only later, after you become more fully Americanized, do you think, so who are the bad people in this situation? And of course, if anybody knows anything about the area around USC, it's a neighborhood full of Latinos and African Americans, in addition to USC students. So it's a possibility that he had some population specifically in mind.
Yeah.
And so the reason why this is intriguing to me, besides the notion of caste, which you could elaborate on, is that for me, as a refugee and as an Asian American, it seems to me that as much discrimination as we experience as immigrants, as refugees, and as Asian Americans, when we come here to this country as immigrants or refugees, we are entering a caste system in which the immigrant or the refugee, while occupying a troubled and troubling position, in the United States, and it varies depending on the political circumstance, are still above Black people and Indigenous peoples in this country. So I don't know, do you agree with that?
Well, I think it depends. I would say it depends on the type of immigrant. I would say that, well, first, just to address the idea of caste, because I wrote this long before I knew that Isabel Wilkerson had a book called Caste, and this is just a chapter that is really talking about social class. And I was struck in America by the fact that this is a country that really promulgates the idea that no matter where you come from, if you work hard, you can be successful. When the reality is, again, if you look at the studies on this, your income is predicted more by your parents' income than by anything else. Your chances of your income is more predicted, for example, by your zip code than by your level of education or the zip code in which you're born, than by your level of education or whatever. So in terms of immigrants and refugees, I would say it really depends on the kind of immigrant and the kind of refugees. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is that I benefited from a great deal of privilege because I came to this country as a graduate student. I spoke the language. I was able to support myself by teaching foreign languages at a private university. This is not, there are other immigrants that come to this country that are undocumented and that are not forced, but they come here and they take the jobs that they can. And those jobs oftentimes are low wages, and within a generation their children are stuck in a cycle of poverty. So it's not necessarily the case that that immigrants and refugees are above a particular race. It's just that depending on the immigrant and the refugee, and depending on how race plays a part in their experiences, then you can see that there are different outcomes. Certainly, I have a friend who used to tell this story. And this is incredible. This friend is from the Middle East, and he said that he had just bought a house, and he didn't have any furniture, and then he didn't have any lights on in the house. The electricity hadn't even been connected yet. So he's stumbling around in his house in the dark with flashlights, trying to find his way. And of course, the neighbors call the cops, and the cops show up. And this being America, the guns are out, and my friend does this, and they say, "Who are you?" And he's like, "I'm the new owner." And the guy and the cop pulled down his gun immediately, and he said, "That's how I knew that I had privilege, because even if you're an immigrant, it just depends where you come from." We know from what we've seen, all of us, that in encounters between a police officer and a Black person, that outcome might not necessarily have ended the same way. So I think there's a lot of factors that are at play. And I think that race is one of the factors. And in this one, in that particular chapter, the focus was on class and how oftentimes class is a proxy for race, because, oftentimes legislatures wouldn't want to write a law that was too obviously racist that would then be deemed unconstitutional. So there are ways in which you can write it so that it is focused on social class. Right. There are all kinds of things you can do to obtain the same results without making it about race. So poll taxes would be one example of that, and how it happened after the Civil War, where it was like based on social class, but actually the effect of it was that it was to stop Black people from voting.
Mm-hmm. So keep asking questions, audience members, and you can also upvote questions. So if you want to see a particular question asked, vote positively, push it up the ladder there for us to see. One of the crucial ways, as you just pointed out, that inequality works in American society is that it often is masked in a way that it is not targeted towards particular groups, even though in effect it is. So I think, for example, of citizenship in this country, the 1790 naturalization law said that citizenship can only be given to free white persons, for example. Okay, that's right. Discriminatory from the beginning.
Right.
But then, for Asian immigrants, for example, they are not allowed to immigrate into this country because they're not eligible for citizenship.
Correct.
They can't own property.
Right.
So the alien land laws in California that forbade Asian immigrants from owning property, did not say Asian immigrants can't own property. It said people who are not eligible for citizenship can't own property.
Right.
So you're screwed.
Right.
It's not formally written into the law. So that's one of the tricky things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's hard for Americans to get their minds around that.
Well, I want to give an example that's actually really current, which is that, do you remember how in July, the Trump administration decided that foreign students who are here on F1 visas, that would have been me back in the day, that because the pandemic happened and all of these classes went online, and the Trump administration said, if you're here on a foreign student visa and your classes are online, pack your bags, you're out of here. You have to take classes in person. And the goal was to basically put pressure on universities, on the one hand, to force them to reopen, and the other is to cut down on some of the numbers of foreign students. But of course, it was a complete disaster for universities who depend on foreign students, not just for labor, remember, who teaches classes, but also for innovation, research, all of that. And so they sued and they won, and the Trump administration backed down. Okay, great. Well, here we are now, 2 months later. Stephen Miller's back. Mm-hmm. And so this is their new rule, which is to bar from having F1 visas any country whose students have a visa overstay rate of over 10%. That means if you send country X has sent 100 students and 10 have stayed over the number of years that is on their visas, that whole country can no longer send foreign students to the United States. So it's an immigration. It's really basically a ban. And what's funny, it's that it's the language. Notice how it says visa overstays. Who overstays visas the most in the country? It's Canadians. And Canadians actually have thousands of people that overstay. But because it's based on rate, the countries that would be most affected ended up being countries in Africa and a couple of countries in Asia. And that is how you make something that seems fair on the surface, but is actually really targeted at various undesirables. Mm-hmm. And as you say, with anti-Asian laws in this country, that is exactly how it was. It was how citizenship was policed. First with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, and then with the slew of laws against Asians, owning property, living in white neighborhoods, attending white schools, and of course, accessing citizenship. The Asian Exclusion Act of 1924, which basically meant no Asians could come here. And, all of the laws in between, they were obsessed with preventing Asians from being citizens. And in fact, this landmark case was actually brought by an Asian American on birthright citizenship, Wong Kim Ark. So this was, I think, 1884, because his parents were Chinese laborers, temporary workers, but he was born in San Francisco, and they would try to deny him citizenship, and that was the precedent that set in motion the idea that anybody who's born here, even if their parents are not citizens, are citizens. Right. But anyway, they were obsessed with
Well, we are virtually in Seattle, right? And it would be interesting to know whether people in Seattle are freaked out about the number of Canadians who have overstayed their visa, who have just crossed over the border. Anyway, so I want to make sure we get to some of the audience questions. And our first question is from Linda Turner. And I wish there was a way I could call on you, Linda, so you can ask your question yourself, but I will read your question to Laila. Is there a way immigration reform could help make us a more welcoming country and in some way reduce white paranoia about loss of status, dominance, and control? That's all yours.
I mean, I think that's a really good question. The short answer is yes, there are ways. The long answer is I don't know that there is political will for such a reform. And that is because we live in a time where immigrants serve as a sort of a scapegoat for everything that is going wrong in American society. And both parties have had opportunities to enact legislation that would help immigrants, and they have not. So, for example, you can think about things like DACA or the DREAM Act, or there's so many things that they could have done that would have made immigration fair, and they haven't. And in fact, now we're going fully in the other direction, where there's all kinds of new restrictions that are passed. The original ban that Trump wrote a proclamation for in 2018 that was upheld by the Supreme Court, and that bans immigration from a bunch of Muslim countries. The new ban that was passed by that was written as an executive order by Trump, that one also bans a bunch of African countries. So we're going in the other direction. The southern border right now makes it extremely difficult, if not impossible, for refugees and asylum seekers to fill out their paperwork and actually apply for asylum at the southern border. I mean, everywhere you look, the foreign student rule that I just mentioned, everywhere you look, there is a sort of restrictions on immigrations being put in place on the one hand, and on the other hand, things that make life more difficult for immigrants who are here without papers. So it's just, I don't know that there is enough political will to change it. I wish that there were, and I hope that with a change of leadership, that might mean that could happen, but I don't know. I think if you look at the history of U.S. immigration, there have been periods of contraction and periods of relative loosening, and it would appear that right now we're in a period of contraction. And so I think that there's a lot of ugliness. I hope that things can change. I hope that there is more political will to help reform immigration. But as you said, a lot of it depends on how people perceive that the treatment of immigrants is not going to apply to them. And what they fail to see is whatever it is that this country does to immigrants, it will eventually do to its own citizens.
Sure. I think one part of the question is about culture and race and national identity, right? So if we let in too many immigrants, is it going to erode whatever we think of as American identity? Is it going to erode white privilege and so on? The other question is related to that is economics. Like, would too many immigrants imperil the economy and take away jobs and all of that? And so I think that, as long as we're a country in which there's a widening gap of economic inequality, and the working class and the poor are also suffering, as they have been for the last 30 or 40 years, it's going to be any kind of immigration reform can't be disattached from economic reform in this country.
Well, I would say to that the irony of that is that the building of walls is precisely what makes it impossible to have like normal migration flows. So before the migration flows, before the wall was built, and by the way, Clinton was the first president that built the very first section of wall. So that's why I see that this isn't something, or let's just blame the Republicans. These are systemic issues. Before the wall, people would come when they needed jobs, and if there was an economic downturn, they would go back. When you have laws that criminalize crossing that border, that make it so that you become, if you get caught, and then you are you get a charge, and if you get caught a second time, then you're a felon, you get incarcerated and all of that. Then you actually disincentivize the fact that people would move away in case they can't find jobs, and they end up staying here even in periods when they might be able to actually make a living elsewhere. So by going against this sort of like normal migratory flow, it's actually making things harder in times of economic downturn like right now.
By the way, audience members, you can still ask questions, and you can upvote the questions we have in the queue. So
you make me scared when you say upvote.
It's like we live in a reality TV world. Everybody's got to compete, including the questions here. All right. So the next question is from I'm sorry if I mispronounced the name, but N. Estefi. For both of you, as a second-generation immigrant, I've personally never felt fully at home in either of my two countries, and often connect most with countries bordering my own. How much do you feel at home in your countries of origin? What are the friction points?
This is a big question. This is the kind of question that requires a 300-page novel.
Which you've written.
Which I have written.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I think that the act of crossing a border and not crossing it temporarily the way you might as a tourist, but to cross it forever really changes you. In the book, I talk about it as being sort of an invisible scar that you have with you. And I think that I am a completely different person than if I had stayed in Morocco and never left. I would still write books, but they would probably be about different topics, because this experience has profoundly changed me. And it has changed how I look at the world. And so therefore, the way in which I'm perceived in this country and the way in which I'm perceived in Morocco are also a result of that crossing. So I feel at home with my family. A home for me is people, not so much a place. But it's true that when I go to Morocco, people do ask a lot of questions about the US. They always ask I always find this actually quite heartening, that Moroccan audiences ask about US audiences and US audiences ask about Moroccan audiences. I think it's very healthy that there's curiosity about one another. And I think also when I find myself in Morocco and I hear things that seem to me to be misperceptions about the US, I end up having to defend the US and correct what seem to me to be matters that need correcting. And the reverse here, right? If I hear something that is being said about Morocco that seems not correct, then I feel that I have to correct them. So there is a sense in which you or at least I, have a foot in both countries, so to speak, and feel a connection to both countries and a kinship with both. But in terms of home itself, I'd rather make people my home.
Yeah, I mean, I have a similar experience. I would say, growing up in a refugee household, I never felt comfortable at home in my own home. So when people raise the question of home, I'm like, well, do you always have to feel comfortable at home? I think that's the assumption that home is a place of comfort. And for a lot of people, home is not a place of comfort. Home is a place of discomfort, or even worse, right? So first of all, we have to say, what do we mean by home, and what kind of function is home supposed to have?
That's true.
And then the second one is, like, we can make our own home. So you make your home with people. And it's true, now that I have a family and children, I feel at home in my own home because I'm boss in my home.
Yeah.
So I like to think. And I feel at home in language. As writers, I think that's really crucial. I feel at home among books. I feel at home in language, the language that I write.
Yeah.
But I think the starting point for me in answering the question is to say that why do we have to feel at home? Why do we have to feel 100% at home? I think many people feel that that's what they should experience. But my feeling is maybe it's actually productive to have at least a little unease. A little discomfort. A little awareness of that home is a privilege.
Yeah.
That a lot of people don't feel good at home, and that feeling good at home can lead to some really terrible things, like people who feel too secure, too comfortable where they are, can do really terrible things.
Yeah.
Abuse other people, kick people out of the house, and you can extend the metaphor to what the nation does. And ethnic and racial populations do to other ethnic and racial populations within a nation that they claim as home. So I think we really need to bring that into question and maybe think about how being aware of the privileges of home and thinking about how being a little uncomfortable and aware that you can be at home somewhere else makes you sensitive to the conditions of homeless people and people who are guests and visitors and so on. So it's a really ethical question that is being raised here.
I mean, I think it's an enriching question. People always think that it's a tragic experience, but it's not. It's actually, I find that it's been central to my development as a writer and as a thinker. I consider it a blessing that I'm able to look at things from this particular perspective.
Right. Okay. So the next question comes from Lynn. Talk about reparations as a way of paying back people who've experienced racism.
Talk about it, just in general.
I'm just reading the question as Lynn wrote it. So.
What was it? Which I remember some years ago. Was it Derrida or somebody? I think it was Derrida. He's like, only in the US do you get these really open-ended questions. Talk about this. I mean, I think that reparations have been done in this country. there is a way in which they can be done. I don't see why they shouldn't be done for particular groups. And there are ways in which it can be done. I absolutely am open to the idea. I think it's actually a fantastic idea. And I hope it can happen someday in my lifetime. I would love to see that. There was a hearing about it. Was it last year? At which I think it was a House hearing on reparations that discussed this topic. And like all previous hearings on the subject, it left with it basically people came and gave testimony, and then everything was wrapped up nicely, and then we never heard about it again. So it would be good if we were in a situation where that would actually happen. I do wonder what kind of condition would we have to be in as a society to get to that level? And I feel that, or rather, I think that it would take a lot more than what we have right now. I think that change happens oftentimes, not just electorally, like you just vote and somehow your electeds do what you want them to do, but kind of the opposite. They have to basically be dragged, kicking and screaming, into doing what you want them to do. And we know this just because there are so many programs that are vastly popular that never see the light of day as legislation. If legislators listened to what people wanted, it wouldn't, you would have universal health care. You would have a bunch of things that you don't actually have. So I think oftentimes they have to be kicking and screaming into the future. So I think that to get to a place where we might see something close to reparations would require a mass movement that of civil disobedience or of protest or something. I don't know that we're going to necessarily get there just through the vote. I don't know if that answers your questions, but obviously I am in favor of reparations.
Well, me too. And I can point directly to a case of reparations, which is Japanese Americans. We already talked about it.
That's what I was thinking about.
And in fact, Congress and President Reagan agreed and passed a bill to give reparations to the survivors of the Japanese American internment experience, granting them $20,000 each, which is a symbolic sum because the Japanese American community lost the equivalent of billions of dollars. And so $20,000 a person hardly makes up for the homes and the farms and everything else that they lost, not to mention mental health and so on. So the country showed the will and the ability to recognize that an injustice was done against the Constitution and against American ideals, and that people should be paid back at least a symbolic sum, and that this would constitute the apology that the country was making. And so if you agree that there was a crime committed against Japanese Americans and that this nation owed them an apology and some kind of material redress and reparations, then why not?
Why not
in slavery and for other crimes that have happened in the formation of this country, and the legacies of which we still live with? So it's not the moral issue. I don't think is the problem. I mean, it is a problem. You have to get people to agree to this, but we already have a precedent. So like you're saying, there's a lack of will, a huge amount of fear, a huge amount of resentment on the part of a lot of people, the reluctance to take responsibility collectively as a nation, to recognize that this country was built on the profits extracted from colonization, genocide, and slavery, and that we should pay people back. And now how that would happen, individual payments or collective payments or community building, that remains to be seen. But I think the principle of reparations, we've already agreed to it with what we've done for Japanese Americans.
Right. That was my point. And then the other thing too is that it's very hard to see us getting to that level when there is not an agreement even about the history. The United States is unique in that because it's a federation, each state is teaching history in its own way. Like, it's just mind-boggling to me coming from a country in which the entire country is taught the same history. I'm not saying that it is necessarily the right history, because each country, in fashioning its sense of identity, engages in erasure of unpleasant moments of its experience. But I'm saying that the entire country is taught the same history. Here, it's kind of, because it's a United States, each state uses slightly different emphases and teaches history differently. And for some reason, something that historians consider to be well-established facts are not even agreed upon by people. I mean, we see the huge backlash against something like the 1619 Project, and that tells you that history is very much an argument. And if people are not even in agreement about the facts, how do we even get to a moment where we're talking about reparations when people are telling you they are denying even some of the history?
Okay, we have time for one last question. Unfortunately, it's a complicated question, but you only have a couple minutes to answer the question, Laila. So here it is. It's from Kanika Agrawal. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Is the notion or expectation of assimilation itself fundamentally flawed?
Absolutely.
Okay, there you go.
I thought you were done. I'm sorry.
There's still more, but you
Yeah.
answered the first part. Or do you think there are ways to reconceptualize likeness/belonging that can challenge inequality and conditionality? All yours.
I do think it is a flawed concept, because who is assimilating to whom? That's what I was talking about earlier. And assimilation is very much a demand that is made by a powerful group toward a less powerful group. The less powerful group is never demanding that other people assimilate to it. It's the other way around. And I think it's really troubling how the other thing too is that there's no definition of assimilation in American society. Nobody tells you, okay, you're assimilated if you meet criteria A, B, C, and D, because then it would be clear and be settled. It's really a kind of like it's in the eye of the beholder. And because it's so ambiguous, it really is a way for the powerful group to police a belonging for everybody else. You're either assimilated or you're not assimilated. So it is a flawed notion, and it is applied in ways that are meant to include or exclude people. And the one that always kind of bothers me is the one around language, because, it's, you're made to feel, I think if you speak foreign languages as a child, or particularly if you speak a foreign language in the home, you're made to feel like you're different and you're not American enough, or if you eat foreign foods or anything like that. And in fact, it's something that is so enriching to speak another language. And then if it's the powerful group that learns a foreign language, then that is a good thing. And that is considered a sign of civilization and a sign of sophistication. And that's what I mean by assimilation being complicated and being wielded by the powerful towards the less powerful, or the politically dominant group against the less politically dominant group. So in short, yes, complicated.
Well, we had a rich and extensive conversation. We had terrific questions from the audience. Audience members, the professor says you get an A in our seminar. And still, I think we only touched upon maybe half of the conditions and issues that you raised in this very rich book, Conditional Citizens, where Laila Lalami demonstrates that she is as fine of an essayist and thinker on the political and cultural questions that matter today as she is a novelist. So I encourage you to go out and not go out. We don't go out. Go online, buy the book, and hopefully one day you'll meet Laila. But like I said, it was written, I assume, over a period of few years, drawn from various kinds of essays and so on. But really, when you read it, it feels like it was written yesterday. Completely addresses the issues, the problems, the challenges that we are facing today as a country. Thank you, Laila.
Thank you, Viet. Thank you so much for doing this with me. And thank you all for being here.
Yeah, I'm Candace, an event manager. Nice to meet you, Viet. I know we didn't meet before, but nice to see you again, Laila. I just want to pop in and say thank you to both of you for talking about such a prescient topic and for your insights. It's been super interesting. And yeah, don't go anywhere. Don't go outside. Click on the Buy the Book button right here. It's going to take you right over to the link at Third Place Books so you can purchase it through them. Thank you all so much for watching. If you want to find out about what's coming up, you can follow this Crowdcast channel by clicking the follow button in the top right corner. And we will see you next time. So thank you both again so much and have a great night.